Chapter 11. Try as she would, Alystra could extract no further information from Kedron. The jester had recovered quickly from his initial shock, and from the panic that had sent him flying back to the surface when he found himself alone in the depths beneath the tomb. He also felt ashamed of his cowardly behavior, and wondered if he would ever have the courage to return to the Chamber of the Moving Ways and the network of world-ranging tunnels that radiated from it. Although he felt that Alvin had been impatient, if not indeed foolhardy, he did not really believe that he would run into any danger. He would return in his own good time. Kedron was certain of that. Well, almost certain. There was just enough doubt to make him feel the need for caution. It would be wise, he decided, to say as little as possible for the time being, and to pass the whole thing off as another joke. Unfortunately for this plan, he had not been able to mask his emotions when Alystra encountered him on his return to the surface. She had seen the fear written so unmistakably in his eyes, and had, at once, interpreted it as meaning that Alvin was in danger. All Kedron's reassurances were in vain, and she became more and more angry with him as they walked together back through the park. At first, Alystra had wanted to remain at the tomb, waiting for Alvin to return in whatever mysterious manner he had vanished. Kedron had managed to convince her that this would be a waste of time, and was relieved when she followed him back to the city. There was a chance that Alvin might return almost at once, and he did not wish anyone else to discover the secret of Yarlin's A. By the time they had reached the city, it was obvious to Kedron that his evasive tactics had failed completely, and that the situation was seriously out of hand. It was the first time in his life that he had ever been at a loss, and had not felt himself capable of dealing with any problem that arose. His immediate and rational fear was being slowly replaced by a profounder and more firmly based alarm. Until now, Kedron had given little thought to the consequences of his actions. His own interests and a mild but genuine sympathy toward Alvin had been sufficient motive for all that he had done. Though he had given encouragement and assistance to Alvin, he had never believed that anything like this could ever really happen. Despite the gulf of years and experience between them, Alvin's will had always been more powerful than his own. It was too late to do anything about it now. Kedron felt that events were sweeping him along toward a climax utterly beyond his control. In view of this, it was a little unfair that Alystra obviously regarded him as Alvin's evil genius and showed an inclination to blame him for all that had happened. Alystra was not really vindicative, but she was annoyed, and part of her annoyance focused on Kedron. If any action of hers caused him trouble, she would be the last person to be sorry. They parted in stony silence when they had reached the great circular way that surrounded the park. Kedron watched Alystra disappear into the distance and wondered wearily what plans were brewing in her mind. There was only one thing of which he could be certain of now. Boredom would not be a serious problem for a considerable time to come. Alystra acted swiftly and with intelligence. She did not bother to contact Arestin and Etania. Alvin's parents were pleasant non-entities for whom she felt some affection, but no respect. They would only waste time in futile arguments and would then do exactly as Alystra was doing now. Jesserac listened to her story without apparent emotion. If he was alarmed or surprised, he concealed it well. So well that Alystra was somewhat disappointed. It seemed to her that nothing so extraordinary and important as this had ever happened before, and Jesserac's matter-of-fact behavior made her feel deflated. When she had finished, he questioned her at some length and hinted, without actually saying so, that she might have made a mistake. What reason was there for supposing that Alvin had really left the city? Perhaps it had been a trick at her expense. The fact that Kedron was involved made this seem highly probable. Alvin might be laughing at her, concealed somewhere in Diaspar at this very moment. The only positive reaction she got out of Jesserac was a promise to make inquiries and to contact her again within a day. In the meantime, she was not to worry and It would also be best if she said nothing to anyone else about the whole affair. There was no need to spread more alarm over an incident that would probably be cleared up in a few hours. Alystra left Jesserac in a mood of mild frustration. She would have been more satisfied could she have seen his behavior immediately after she had left. Jesserac had friends on the council. He had been a member himself in his long life, and might be again if he was unlucky. He called 3 of his most influential colleagues and cautiously aroused their interest. As Alvin's tutor, he was well aware of his own delicate position and was anxious to safeguard himself. For the present, the fewer who knew what had happened, the better. It was immediately agreed that the first thing to do was to contact Kedron and ask for an explanation. There was only one defect in the excellent plan. Kedron had anticipated it and was nowhere to be found. If there was any ambiguity about Alvin's position, his hosts were very careful not to remind him of it. He was free to go anywhere he wished in Airlie, the little village over which Serranus ruled, though that was too strong a word to describe her position. Sometimes it seemed to Alvin that she was a benevolent dictator, but at others, it appeared that she had no powers at all. So far, he had failed to completely understand the social system of Lys, either because it was too simple or else so complex that its ramifications eluded him. All he had discovered for certain was that Lys was divided into innumerable villages, of which Airlie was quite a typical example. Yet, in a sense, there were no typical examples, for Alvin had been assured that every village tried to be as unlike its neighbors as possible. It was all extremely confusing. Though it was very small and contained less than 1,000 people, Airlie was full of surprises. There was hardly a single aspect of life that did not differ from its counterpart in Diaspar. The differences extended even to such fundamentals as speech. Only the children used their voices for normal communication. The adults scarcely ever spoke, and after a while, Alvin decided that they did so only out of politeness to him. It was a curiously frustrating experience to feel oneself enmeshed in a great net of soundless and undetectable words. But after a while, Alvin grew accustomed to it. It seemed surprising that vocal speech had survived at all, since there was no longer any use for it. But Alvin later discovered that the people of Lys were very fond of singing, and indeed of all forms of music. Without this incentive, it was very likely that they would long ago have become completely mute. They were always busy, engaged on tasks or problems which were usually incomprehensible to Alvin. When he could understand what they were doing, much of their work seemed quite unnecessary. A considerable part of their food, for example, was actually grown, and not synthesized in accordance with patterns worked out ages ago. When Alvin commented on this, it was patiently explained to him that the people of Lys like to watch things grow, to carry out complicated genetic experiments, and to evolve ever more subtle tastes and flavors. Airlie was famous for its fruits, but when Alvin ate some choice samples, they seemed to him no better than those he could have conjured up in Diaspar by no more effort than raising a finger. At first he wondered if the people of Lys had forgotten, or had never possessed, the powers and machines that he took for granted, and upon which all life in Diaspar was based. He soon found that this was not the case. The tools and the knowledge were there, but they were only used when it was essential. The most striking example of this was provided by the transport system, if it could be dignified by such a name. For short distances, people walked, and seemed to enjoy it. If they were in a hurry or had small loads to move, they used animals which had obviously been developed for the purpose. The freight-carrying species was a low, six-legged beast, very docile and strong, but of poor intelligence. The racing animals were of a different breed altogether, normally walking on 4 legs, but using only their heavily muscled limbs when they really got up speed. They could cross the entire width of Lys in a few hours, and the passenger rode in a pivoted seat strapped on the creature's back. Nothing in the world would have induced Alvin to risk such a ride, though it was a very popular sport among the younger men. Their finely bred steeds were the aristocrats of the animal world, and were well aware of it. They had fairly large vocabularies, and Alvin often overheard them talking boastfully among themselves about past and future victories. When he tried to be friendly and attempted to join in the conversation, they pretended that they could not understand him, and if he persisted, would go bounding off in outraged dignity. These two varieties of animals sufficed for all ordinary needs, and gave their owners a great deal of pleasure which no mechanical contrivances could have done. But when extreme speed was required, or vast loads had to be moved, the machines were there, and were used without hesitation. Though the animal life of Lys presented Alvin with a whole world of new interests and surprises, it was the two extremes of the human population range that fascinated him most of all. The very young and the very old. Both were equally strange to him and equally amazing. Airlie's most senior inhabitant had barely attained his second century, and had only a few more years of life before him. When he had reached that age, Alvin reminded himself, his body would scarcely have altered, whereas this old man, who had no chain of future existences to look forward to as compensation, had almost exhausted his physical powers. His hair was completely white, and his face an unbelievably intricate mass of wrinkles. He seemed to spend most of his time sitting in the sun or walking slowly around the village, exchanging soundless greetings with everyone he met. As far as Alvin could tell, he was completely contented, asking no more of life, and was not distressed by its approaching end. Here was a philosophy so much at variance with that of Diaspar as to be completely beyond Alvin's comprehension. Why should anyone accept death when it was so unnecessary, when you had the choice of living for 1,000 years and then leaping forward through the millenniums to make a new start in a world that you had helped to shape? This was one mystery he was determined to solve as soon as he had the chance of discussing it frankly. It was very hard for him to believe that Lys had made this choice of its own free will, if it knew the alternative that existed. He found part of his answer among the children, those little creatures who were as strange to him as any of the animals of Lys. He spent much of his time among them, watching them at their play and eventually being accepted by them as a friend. Sometimes it seemed to him that they were not human at all. Their motives, their logic, and even their language were so alien. He would look unbelievingly at the adults and ask himself how it was possible that they could have evolved from these extraordinary creatures who seemed to spend most of their lives in a private world of their own. And yet, even while they baffled him, they aroused within his heart a feeling he had never known before, when, which was not often but sometimes happened, they burst into tears of utter frustration or despair. Their tiny disappointment seemed to him more tragic than man's long retreat after the loss of his galactic empire. That was something too huge and remote for comprehension, but the weeping of a child could pierce one to the heart. Alvin had met love in Diaspar, but now he was learning something equally precious, and without which love itself could never reach its highest fulfillment, but must remain forever incomplete. He was learning tenderness. If Alvin was studying Lys, Lys was also studying him, and was not dissatisfied with what it had found. He had been in Airlie for 3 days when Serranus suggested that he might like to go further afield and see something more of her country. It was a proposal he accepted at once, on condition that he was not expected to ride one of the village's prize racing beasts. "I can assure you," said Serranus, with a rare flash of humor, "that no one here would dream of risking one of their precious animals. Since this is an exceptional case, I will arrange transport in which you will feel more at home.
Hilvar will act as your guide, but of course, you can go wherever you please."
Alvin wondered if that was strictly true. He imagined that there would be some objection if he tried to return to the little hill from whose summit he had first emerged into Lys. However, that did not worry him for the moment, since he was in no hurry to go back to Diaspar, and indeed had given little thought to the problem after his initial meeting with Seranus. Life here was still so interesting and so novel that he was still quite content to live in the present. He appreciated Seranus' gesture in offering her son as his guide, though doubtless Hilvar had been given careful instructions to see to it that he did not get into mischief. It had taken Alvin some time to get accustomed to Hilvar, for a reason which he could not very well explain to him without hurting his feelings. Physical perfection was so universal in Diaspar that personal beauty had been completely devalued. Men noticed it no more than the air they breathed. This was not the case in Lys, and the most flattering adjective that could be applied to Hilvar was homely. By Alvin's standards, he was downright ugly, and for a while he had deliberately avoided him. If Hilvar was aware of this, he showed no sign of it, and it was not long before his good-natured friendliness had broken through the barrier between them. The time was to come when Alvin would be so accustomed to Hilvar's broad, twisted smile, his strength, and his gentleness that he could scarcely believe he had ever found him unattractive, and would not have changed him for any consideration in the world. They left Airlie soon after dawn in a small vehicle which Hilvar called a ground car, and which apparently worked on the same principle as the machine that had brought Alvin from Diaspar. It floated in the air a few inches above the turf, and, although there was no sign of any guide rail, Hilvar told him that the cars could run only on predetermined routes. All the centers of population were linked together in this fashion, but during his entire stay in Lys, Alvin never saw another ground car in use. Hilvar had put a great deal of effort into organizing this expedition, and was obviously looking forward to it quite as much as Alvin. He had planned the route with his own interests in mind, for natural history was his consuming passion, and he hoped to find new types of insect life in the relatively uninhabited regions of Lys which they would be visiting. He intended to travel as far south as the machine could take them, and the rest of the way they would have to go on foot. Not realizing the full implications of this, Alvin made no objections. They had a companion with them on the journey, Criff, the most spectacular of Hilvar's many pets. When Criff was resting, his 6 gauzy wings lay folded along his body, which glittered through them like a jeweled scepter. If something disturbed him, he would rise into the air with a flicker of iridescence and a faint whirring of invisible wings. Though the great insect would come when called and would sometimes obey simple orders, it was almost wholly mindless. Yet, it had a definite personality of its own, and for some reason was suspicious of Alvin, whose sporadic attempts to gain its confidence always ended in failure. To Alvin, the journey across Lys had a dreamlike unreality. Silent as a ghost, the machine slid across rolling plains and wound its way through forests, never deviating from its invisible track. It traveled perhaps 10 times as fast as a man could comfortably walk. Seldom indeed was any inhabitant of Lys in a greater hurry than that. They passed through many villages, some larger than Airlie, but most of them built along very similar lines. Alvin was interested to notice the subtle but significant differences in clothing and even physical appearances that occurred as they moved from one community to the next. The civilization of Lys was composed of hundreds of distinct cultures, each contributing some special talent toward the whole. The ground car was well stocked with Airlie's most famous product, a small yellow peach which was gratefully received whenever Hilvar gave away some samples. He often stopped to talk to friends and to introduce Alvin, who never ceased to be impressed by the simple courtesy with which everyone used vocal speech as soon as they knew who he was. It must often have been very tedious to them, but as far as he could judge, they always resisted the temptation to relapse into telepathy, and he never felt excluded from their conversation. They made their longest pause at a tiny village, almost hidden in a sea of tall golden grass, which soared high above their heads and which undulated in the gentle wind as if it was endowed with life. As they moved through it, they were continually overtaken by rolling waves as the countless blades bowed in unison above them. At first it was faintly disturbing, for Alvin had a foolish fancy that the grass was bending down to look at him, but after a while he found the continual motion quite restful. Alvin soon discovered why they made this stop. Among the little crowd that had already gathered before the car came gliding into the village was a shy, dark girl whom Hilvar introduced as Niara. They were obviously very pleased to see one another again, and Alvin felt envious of their patent happiness at this brief reunion. Hilvar was clearly torn between his duties as a guide and his desire to have no other company but Niara, and Alvin soon rescued him from this quandary by setting off on a tour of exploration by himself. There was not much to see in this little village, but he took his time. When they started on their way again, there were many questions he was anxious to ask Hilvar. He could not imagine what love must be like in a telepathic society, and after a discreet interval, he broached the subject. Hilvar was willing enough to explain, even though Alvin suspected that he had made his friend interrupt a prolonged and tender mental leave-taking. In Lys, it seemed, all love began with mental contact, and it might be months or years before a couple actually met. In this way, Hilvar explained, there could be no false impressions, no deceptions on either side. Two people whose minds were open to one another could hide no secrets. If either attempted it, the other partner would know at once that something was being concealed. Only very mature and well-balanced minds could afford such honesty. Only love based upon absolute unselfishness could survive it. Alvin could well understand that such a love would be deeper and richer than anything his people could know. It could be so perfect, in fact, that he found it hard to believe that it could ever occur at all. Yet Hilvar assured him that it did, and became starry-eyed and lost in his own reveries when Alvin pressed him to be more explicit. There were some things that could not be communicated. One either knew them or did not. Alvin decided sadly that he could never attain the kind of mutual understanding which these fortunate people had made the very basis of their lives. When the ground car emerged from the savannah, which ended abruptly as though a frontier had been drawn around which the grass was not permitted to grow, there was a range of low, heavily wooded hills ahead of them. This was an outpost, Hilvar explained, of the main rampart guarding Lys. The real mountains lay beyond, but to Alvin, even these small hills were an impressive and awe-inspiring sight. The car came to a halt in a narrow, sheltered valley which was still flooded by the warmth and light of the descending sun. Hilvar looked at Alvin with a kind of wide-eyed candor which, one could have sworn, was totally innocent of any guile. "This is where we start to walk," he said cheerfully, beginning to throw equipment out of the vehicle. "We can't ride any farther." Alvin looked at the hills surrounding them, at the comfortable seat in which he had been riding. "Isn't there a way around?" he asked, but not very hopefully. "Of course," replied Hilvar, "but we're not going around. We're going to the top, which is much more interesting. I'll put the car on automatic so that it will be waiting for us when we get down to the other side." Determined not to give in without a struggle, Alvin made one last effort. "It will be dark soon," he protested. "We'll never be able to go all that way before sunset." "Exactly," said Hilvar, sorting packages and equipment with incredible speed. "We'll spend the night on the summit and finish the journey in the morning." For once, Alvin knew when he was beaten. The gear that they were carrying looked very formidable, but though it was bulky, it weighed practically nothing. It was all packed in gravity-polarizing containers that neutralized its weight, leaving only inertia to be contended with. As long as Alvin moved in a straight line, he was not conscious that he was carrying any load. Dealing with these containers required a little practice, for if he attempted to make a sudden change of direction, his pack seemed to develop a stubborn personality and did its best to keep him on his original course until he had overcome its momentum. When Hilvar had adjusted all the straps and satisfied himself that everything was in order, they began to walk slowly up the valley. Alvin looked back wistfully as the ground car retraced its track and disappeared from sight. He wondered how many hours would elapse before he could again relax in its comfort. Nevertheless, it was very pleasant, climbing upward with the mild sun beating on their backs and seeing ever new vistas unfold around them. There was a partly obliterated path which disappeared from time to time, but which Hilvar seemed able to follow even when Alvin could see no trace of it. He asked Hilvar what had made the path, and was told that there were many small animals in these hills, some solitary and some living in primitive communities which echoed many of the features of human civilization. A few had even discovered, or been taught, the use of tools and fire. It never occurred to Alvin that such creatures might be other than friendly. Both he and Hilvar took this for granted, for it had been many ages since anything on Earth had challenged the supremacy of man. They had been climbing for half an hour when Alvin first noticed the faint, reverberating murmur in the air around him. He could not detect its source, for it seemed to come from no particular direction. It never ceased, and it grew steadily louder as the landscape widened around them. He would have asked Hilvar what it was, but it had become necessary to save his breath for more essential purposes. Alvin was in perfect health. Indeed, he had never had an hour's illness in his life. But physical well-being, however important and necessary it might be, was not sufficient for the task he was facing now. He had the body, but he did not possess the skill. Hilvar's easy strides, the effortless surge of power which took him up every slope, filled Alvin with envy, and a determination not to give in while he could still place one foot in front of the other. He knew perfectly well that Hilvar was testing him, and did not resent the fact. It was a good-natured game, and he entered into the spirit of it, even while the fatigue spread slowly through his legs. Hilvar took pity on him when they had completed 2/3 of the ascent, and they rested for a while, propped up against a westward-facing bank, letting the mellow sunlight drench their bodies. The throbbing thunder was very strong now, and although Alvin questioned him, Hilvar refused to explain it. It would, he said, spoil the surprise if Alvin knew what to expect at the end of the climb. They were now racing against the sun, but fortunately the final ascent was smooth and gentle. The trees that had covered the lower part of the hill had thinned out now, as if they too were tired of the fight against gravity, and for the last few hundred yards the ground was carpeted with short, wiry grass on which it was very pleasant to walk. As the summit came in sight, Hilvar put forth a sudden burst of energy and went racing up the slope. Alvin decided to ignore the challenge. Indeed, he had no choice. He was quite content to plod steadily onward, and when he had caught up with Hilvar to collapse in contented exhaustion by his side. Not until he had regained his breath was he able to appreciate the view spread out beneath him, and to see the origin of the endless thunder which now filled the air. The ground ahead fell away steeply from the crest of the hill, so steeply indeed that it soon became an almost vertical cliff, and leaping far out from the face of the cliff was a mighty ribbon of water, which curved out through space to crash into the rocks 1,000 feet below. There, it was lost in a shimmering mist of spray, while up from the depths rose that ceaseless drumming thunder that reverberated in hollow echoes from the hills on either side. Most of the waterfall was now in shadow, but the sunlight streaming past the mountains still illuminated the land beneath, adding the final touch of magic to the scene. For quivering in evanescent beauty above the base of the fall was the last rainbow left on earth. Hilvar waved his arm in a sweep, which embraced the whole horizon. "From here," he said, raising his voice so that it could be heard above the thunder of the waterfall, "you can see right across Lys." Alvin could well believe him. To the north lay mile upon mile of forest, broken here and there by clearings and fields and the wandering threads of 100 rivers. Hidden somewhere in that vast panorama was the village of Airlie, but it was hopeless to try to find it. Alvin fancied that he could catch a glimpse of the lake past which the path led to the entrance. Alvin fancied that he could catch a glimpse of the lake past which the path led to the entrance into Lys, but decided that his eyes had tricked him. Still farther north, trees and clearings alike were lost in a mottled carpet of green, rocked here and there by lines of hills. And beyond that, at the very edge of vision, the mountains that hemmed Lys from the desert lay like a bank of distant clouds. East and west, the view was little different, but to the south, the mountains seemed only a few miles away. Alvin could see them very clearly, and he realized that they were far higher than the little peak on which he was standing. They were separated from him by country that was much wilder than the land through which he had just passed. In some indefinable way, it seemed deserted and empty, as if man had not lived here for many, many years. Ilvar answered Alvin's unspoken question. "Once, that part of Lys was inhabited," he said. "I don't know why it was abandoned. Perhaps one day we shall move into it again. Only the animals live there now." Indeed, there was nowhere any sign of human life, none of the clearings or well-disciplined rivers that spoke of man's presence. Only in one spot was there any indication that he had ever lived here. For many miles away, a solitary white ruin jutted above the forest roof like a broken fang. Elsewhere, the jungle had returned to its own. The sun was sinking below the western walls of Lys. For a breathless moment, the distant mountains seemed to burn with golden flames. Then, the land they guarded was swiftly drowned with shadow, and night had come. "We should have done this before," said Hilvar, practical as ever, as he started to unload their equipment. "It'll be pitch dark in 5 minutes, and cold, too." Curious pieces of apparatus began to cover the grass. A slim tripod extended a vertical rod carrying a pear-shaped bulge at its end. Hilvar raised this until the pair was just clear of their heads, and gave some mental signal which Alvin could not intercept. At once, their little encampment was flooded with light, and the darkness retreated. The pair gave not only light, but also heat, for Alvin could feel a gentle caressing glow that seemed to sink into his very bones. Carrying the tripod in one hand and his pack in the other, Hilvar walked down the slope while Alvin hurried behind, doing his best to keep in the circle of light. He finally pitched camp in a small depression a few hundred yards below the crest of the hill, and started to put the rest of his equipment into operation. First came a large hemisphere of some rigid and almost invisible material, which englobed them completely and protected them from the cool breeze which had now begun to blow up the face of the hill. The dome appeared to be generated by a small rectangular box which Hilvar placed on the ground and then ignored completely, even to the extent of burying it beneath the rest of his paraphernalia. Perhaps this also projected the comfortable, semi-transparent couches on which Alvin was so glad to relax. It was the first time he had seen furniture materialized in Lys, where it seemed to him that the houses were terribly cluttered up with permanent artifacts which wouldn't be much better kept safely out of the way in memory banks. The meal which Hilvar produced from yet another of his receptacles was also the first purely synthetic one that Alvin had eaten since reaching Lys. There was a steady blast of air sucked through some orifice in the dome overhead as the matter converter seized its raw material and performed its everyday miracle. On the whole, Alvin was much happier with purely synthetic food. The way in which the other kind was prepared struck him as being appallingly unhygienic, and at least with the matter converters, you knew exactly what you were eating. They settled down for their evening meal as the night deepened around them and the stars came out. When they had finished, it was completely dark beyond their circle of light, and at the edge of that circle, Alvin could see dim shapes moving as the creatures of the forest crept out of their hiding places. From time to time, he caught the glint of reflected light as pale eyes stared back at him. But whatever beasts were watching out there would come no closer, so he could see nothing more of them. It was very peaceful, and Alvin felt utterly content. For a while, they lay on their couches and talked about the things that they had seen, the mystery that enmeshed them both, and the many ways in which their two cultures differed. Hilvar was fascinated by the miracle of the eternity circuits, which had put Diaspar beyond the reach of time, and Alvin found some of his questions very hard to answer. "What I don't understand," said Hilvar, "is how the designers of Diaspar made certain that nothing would ever go wrong with the memory circuits. You tell me that the information defining the city and all the people who live in it is stored as patterns of electric charge inside crystals. Well, crystals will last forever, but what about all the circuits associated with them? Aren't there ever any failures of any kind?" I asked Kedron that same question, and he told me that the memory banks are virtually triplicated. Any one of the three banks can maintain the city, and if anything goes wrong with one of them, the other two automatically correct it. Only if the same failure occurred simultaneously in two of the banks would any permanent damage be done. The chances of that are infinitesimal. And how is the relation maintained between the patterns stored in the memory units and the actual structure of the city? Between the plan, as it were, and the thing it describes? Alvin was now completely out of his depth. He knew that the answer involved technologies that relied on the manipulation of space itself, but how one could lock an atom rigidly in the position defined by data stored elsewhere was something he could not begin to explain. On a sudden inspiration, he pointed to the invisible dome protecting them from the night. "Tell me how this roof above our heads is created by that box you're sitting on," he answered, "and then I'll explain how the eternity circuits work." Hilvar laughed. "I suppose it's a fair comparison. You'd have to ask one of our field theory experts if you wanted to know that. I certainly couldn't tell you." This reply made Alvin very thoughtful. So there were still men in Lys who understood how their machines worked. That was more than could be said of Diaspar. Thus, they talked and argued, until presently Hilvar said, "I'm tired. What about you? Are you going to sleep?" Alvin rubbed his still weary limbs. "I'd like to," he confessed, "but I'm not sure I can. It still seems a strange custom to me." "It is a good deal more than a custom," smiled Hilvar. "I've been told that it was once a necessity to every human being. We still like to sleep at least once a day, even if only for a few hours. During that time, the body refreshes itself, and the mind as well. Does no one in Diaspar ever sleep?" "Only on very rare occasions," said Alvin. "Jesserak, my tutor, has done it once or twice after he has made some exceptional mental effort. A well-designed body should have no need for such rest periods. We did away with them millions of years ago." Even as he spoke these rather boastful words, his actions belied them. He felt a weariness such as he had never before known. It seemed to spread from his calves and thighs until it flowed through all his body. There was nothing unpleasant about the sensation, rather the reverse. Hilvar was watching him with an amused smile, and Alvin had enough faculties left to wonder if his companion was exercising any of his mental powers upon him. If so, he did not object in the least. The light flooding down from the metal pair overhead sank to a faint glow, but the warmth it was radiating continued unabated. By the last flicker of light, Alvin's drowsy mind registered a curious fact which he would have to inquire about in the morning. Hilvar had stripped off his clothes, and for the first time, Alvin saw how much the two branches of the human race had diverged. Some of the changes were merely ones of emphasis or proportion, but others such as the external genitals and the presence of teeth, nails, and definite body hair, were more fundamental. What puzzled him most of all, however, was the curious small hollow in the pit of Hilvar's stomach. When, some days later, he suddenly remembered the subject, it took a good deal of explaining. By the time that Hilvar had made the functions of the navel quite clear, he had uttered many thousands of words and drawn half a dozen diagrams, and both he and Alvin had made a great step forward in understanding the basis of each other's cultures.